It's great to be here with you. I chose to talk about almost anything I wanted, so I call it the foreign policy challenges of the Obama administration, which gives me a license to steal. It's all about communication in a way, which reminds me of the story of this woman who went to visit a lawyer. She wanted a divorce from her husband. So the lawyer said, well, let's sit down, let's talk. He said, do you have grounds? And she says, yes, about 2 acres. And he said, no, I mean, do you have a grudge, or does he? No, we just park on the street. And so he scratched his head for a minute and said, well, does he beat you up? And she says, no, I get up at 4:30 in the morning. He doesn't get up till 6. So the lawyer throws up his hands and he said, well, would you just tell me what the problem is? And she says, well, we just have trouble communicating. So I hope I can do better than that with you today. Each president, when he comes into office, faces a world which has unique aspects to it. So the problems that face a president are never the same ones that face another president. Time moves on, the world changes. I think President Obama, when he came in, to me, he had 3 big tasks, challenges ahead of him. The first one was to change the mood in the country and toward the country. The Pew Foundation does annual polls around the world of attitudes, different countries toward the United States. In 2008, they were the worst I have ever seen them in terms of people's attitude toward the United States. Not toward Americans necessarily, but toward the United States. So that's the first task that he had. The second task is that the world has changed dramatically from the time of the Cold War, and the currents that are running in the world go under the general heading of globalization. We're changing things so rapidly that all the old truths didn't seem to work anymore. So he had to come to grips with a world that's changing much more rapidly than we psychologically could come up with. And the last thing, of course, was to figure out policies to deal with specific foreign policy interests. Now, how's he done on these 3 tasks? I think on the first one, the mood, he's done a really good job. Mood in this country was lifted significantly, but especially the mood toward the United States has shown some dramatic changes. And he gave 3 major foreign policy speeches around the world in his first few months. One in Prague, where he mentioned the notion of doing away with nuclear weapons. One in Istanbul, where he talked about some of those particular problems with Turkey. And especially one in Cairo, where he spoke to the Middle East. And I was over in the region just after the speech, and there was almost a sense of euphoria that here's somebody who understood the problems, who really realized what they were going through, what their life was like, and would do something about it. So that part of it, I think he did well. The second task, that of coming to grips with the environment, that you can't expect much there. That's an evolutionary process. And first of all, the world we live in now is so different from the world of the Cold War, the world where I spent most of my time, and I see a few people in the audience who are as old, was a very different world. It was a world of overwhelming danger in the sense that if we made a serious mistake, we could end up with a nuclear war that could destroy everybody. But it was a very focused world. It was focused on the Soviet Union and the threats of the Soviet Union. We knew what the problem was, and we knew basically what we needed to do. It wasn't always easy to do it, but we knew what we had to do. Now, suddenly, in the blink of an eye, that world was gone, and we were faced with a different world, almost the polar opposite of the Cold War. There was no existential threat. There were a lot of little pinprick threats, but none of them threatened the existence of the United States. And they were all over everywhere. So instead of the focus directly on the Soviet Union, there was a focus everywhere. We didn't even know where the threats were until they appeared, for example. So that's a fundamentally different world. On top of that, changes in the world. Globalization, the spread of problems that tend to erode national boundaries. Issues of climate, for example, of health care, of information, flow of information, all kinds of technology. The nation state can no longer provide for its citizens the way that it used to. It has to reach out to other countries for cooperation to deal with some of the biggest problems that we face. That is a serious problem for us all. It has, as I say, not only eroded national boundaries, it has changed the nature of power and the nature of warfare in some respects. Power, we're probably, at the end of the Cold War, the strongest nation the world has ever known in comparison to any other nations. And yet, have we gotten our way in the world? No. No. Despite efforts to do so. We had the most awesome military machine anyone's ever had. What was it prepared for? For like fighting on the West German plain against a sophisticated enemy like the old Soviet Union. Not for kicking down the doors in Baghdad looking for terrorists or thugs. So there's been a fundamental change in the way, in the environment of the world. That has gone to the participation of the people of the world. For most of mankind, most of the people in the world knew maybe what was going on in their own village and maybe the next village, but not much else, and they didn't care. All the big struggles of empire and so on went above everybody's head. They just lived their own lives, were left alone. Now, everybody is within earshot of a radio or eye shot of a TV set. They all know what's going on, and they're activated by it. They're motivated by it. And I think one of the reasons that we're so beset by forces like terrorism, for example, is people are angry. They look at TV and say, why do those people have all that? And why are they saying that about me? Or why can't I enjoy those kinds of things? So we have a much more volatile world. Now, to go, that's enough about that, but to go one step further, we're dealing with institutions. We're dealing with this world with institutions that were built for the world of the Cold War. Most of our big institutions came out of World War II or the Cold War. In our domestic government, the Department of Defense, I've already described. The CIA was built to focus on the Soviet Union, like a laser on the Soviet Union. Instead, they turn around and they focus on 195 countries in the world. How do you know which one's going to threaten us? They're not equipped to cover 195 world. How do you assimilate? How do you decide? It's a very different world. NATO. NATO is a great military alliance, one of the few ever that knows how to fight together. But for what? The original purpose for NATO is pretty much disappeared. So is there a way to use that wonderful alliance for something in a world which has changed so dramatically? And last but not least, there's the United Nations, built in 1945 for a world which has disappeared. It had 52 original members. It now has 192. And most of those additional members either didn't exist or were colonies of the 52. So they have very different notions and ideas about what's right and wrong and how the world ought to work. And you would think in a globalized world the UN would be exactly what we need to cooperate across national boundaries. But it wasn't built for that. And we're having great trouble making it work. There's a fundamental contradiction in the United Nations. Article 2 of the UN says that nothing in the Charter gives the right of the UN to interfere in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of its members. In other words, stay out of the internal politics of its members. And yet, we've had several Security Council resolutions sanctioning what's called the responsibility to protect. And that is, when a country does not or cannot protect major elements of its own population, it's the duty of the UN to intervene and provide protection to those groups. Now, those two are in fundamental conflict. And Darfur is a good example of that. There are horrors going on in Darfur, but Sudan says, no, we don't want you there. So half of the Security Council says, no, we're not allowed to, and the other says, yes, we need to. Those are the kinds of things that we're going through now to adapt our psychology and our institutions to a world which is so different from that which has framed our experience. That we just run up against all the time, but it's one of the problems that President Obama has. How fast do you change the institutions? How do you change them to better fit? And how do you change attitudes of mind so that they keep up with the world? The last one, that is undertaking specific policies and actions to deal with the exceedingly complex problems we face, is still very much a work in progress. This, I think, is the area where the President has been subjected to the most criticisms. And let me go back to his speech in Cairo as an example. He brought forth a spirit of euphoria in the region. But now, a year later, they're saying, where is it? Where's the delivery? Where's the policy which is behind these wonderful words that are going to put them into action? And I think that's increasingly the criticism of this administration is that the results have not begun to match the rhetoric, and leading in some cases to questions whether the president is all rhetoric and no executive ability to implement. I think it's too early to come to that conclusion, and there are some promising results to the contrary. I think, for example, in Afghanistan, he has looked at it and put in place what is probably, for a very difficult circumstance, an optimal strategy. Though I must say, I think he got there through the back door. Because when he was campaigning, one of his articles of faith was to get U.S. forces out of Iraq, and saying, the place we need to be is Afghanistan. That's what, well, I don't know if he believed it or not, but he really didn't understand what he was getting into. Now he's inherited Afghanistan, which is a much more intractable problem than Iraq. And the question is, can we deal with Afghanistan? Much less Pakistan, which is the great, I was going to say prize. Let me change that and say problem in the region. Pakistan is a big country. Pakistan, 180 million people. It is a very troubled country and has been since its independence. It has a much more tribal character than India. It is harder to govern physically because it's very mountainous. It's never been able to manage democracy very well. 4 times the military has stepped in, kicked out the civilian government, sort of straightened things out, turned it back, only to have it revert again. It has a very weak government now. There's a very weak opposition political leadership. The military is still a key element of the unity of the country, but military government, again, is not an attractive option. So Pakistan is really the key area there. Another, for example, Mumbai terrorist attack on India could result in a fairly full-fledged conflict there, which we could not simply stand aside from, and which the Chinese probably couldn't either. So there are huge stakes there. So Afghanistan is extremely important. And what the president did is take a war of counterterrorism and turn it into a war of insurgency. Now, what's the difference? Well, if your objective is counterterrorism, you find a terrorist, you go after them and eliminate them. If in the process you kill some civilians, it's too bad, but it's collateral damage, because your goal is to wipe out terrorism. If your policy is counterinsurgency and you have that same situation, you don't go after the bad guy, because killing the civilians is more injurious to what you're trying to achieve than getting the terrorist killed achieves. So it's a fundamental change, and what we're really trying to do in Afghanistan is to restore to the Afghan people a sense that they don't have to be afraid, they don't have to be terrorized, that they can run their own system, whether it's local government, whether it's from Kabul, and so on. To do that, we have to change our tactics. What we had been doing is moving into villages and cleaning out the bad guys and then moving back out. Well, as soon as we move back out, the bad guys come back in, kill all the people that have cooperated with the Americans, and terrorize the people. So you've got to move in and stay. Stay until the Afghan army can replace you and provide that sense of security which will take away the Taliban's chief asset. Well, the Afghan army is not strong enough. And behind the Afghan army is the Afghan government. And the Afghan government has been part of the problem because they have sent corrupt officials out who tend to figuratively rape the people, corruption, so on. So we have two fundamental problems. First is to clean out the bad people from control over the territories where they control, which are many less than half the country, much less than half the country. And then train the Afghan army so it can replace us as we withdraw, and change the Karzai government, which is impossible, but change its attitude so it is seen as a positive force, not a negative force. So we need Karzai. He's in Washington today, and we're putting our arms around him after having tried to boot him out of office. We need him badly, but he needs us, because he can't succeed without us. Is it all going to work? Who knows? But I think there is some place where the president has taken hold, has seen and changed the strategy to one which has at least the opportunity of producing results. Now, back in Iraq, which he wanted to leave during the campaign, we've had an election, interesting results, and despite the paper this morning with 100 people killed with terrorist attacks and so on, the Iraqi army is doing a pretty good job of maintaining the rudiments of security. But the really key question is, can the government, which is a very disparate government, you think we're having problems between Republicans and Democrats now. You ain't seen nothing. Between the Sunnis, the Shias of various stripes, and the Kurds, trying to get a government which is minimally tolerable to all of them is a Herculean task. And I think it can best be done, if it can be, while the U.S. still has a significant military presence. Because then they're most likely to contain their differences and jockeying around to political rhetoric and to try to solve the problem politically. If we leave before they have put together a reasonable government, then it's most likely to be a zero-sum game with either the strongest guy winning or the country splitting up. So Iraq is maybe okay, but follow the putting together of the government, because it's still a tough proposition. The other place that the president has taken over and has done some work is what they called resetting relations with Russia. You know, that's an interesting simile, because the reset button, you know, it's something you have on your computer. It gets all tangled up, and you push reset. And lo and behold, it all cleans it all out, and you start over. You don't have to do anything. Well, it's not quite that way. And I think it's been a lot slower and a lot harder, because the Russians were maybe not ready to be reset. But I think at the end of the Cold War, we didn't really appreciate the depth of the humiliation they felt at the end of the Cold War, when they went from being one of two superpowers to a military which was disintegrating and an economy about the size of Belgium. And you can listen to Putin and you hear the anger and frustration. When we were weak, when we were flat on our backs, you walked all over us. You pushed the borders of NATO up right to the edge of Russia. You denounced the ABM treaty. You did this and you did that because we were weak. Well, now we're strong and we're not going to put up with it anymore. So that's the kind of attitude, and that's what the reset button really needs to do. I think the president has made a good start. He's changed the nature of the missile defense system in Eastern Europe so that it is more clearly designed against Iran than a problem for Russians. And just recently completed a follow-on arms control treaty. Now, it was a modest treaty, but it was absolutely necessary if we're going to move ahead with the Russians on nuclear arms control. And they still are a superpower in nuclear weapons. Between us, we have 95% of all the nuclear weapons in the world. So to be able to move forward, we had to preserve all of the rules for inspections, for how you count warheads and how you count delivery, all of the details that give each side the confidence that they're moving ahead and understanding what the other side's doing, not just taking it on faith. So it was a good start. And the president has pushed now one step farther by holding a summit in Washington with the most foreign leaders ever, except maybe once at a UN annual meeting. 47 heads of state came, and it was a meeting on nuclear security, protecting our nuclear weapons and nuclear material from terrorists. It was a good thing to do, because everybody, even the bad guys, most of the bad guys, don't want nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists. So it's something everybody could agree on, and I think the president has made a really good start. But there are a lot of problems in this world, a lot of really vexing problems, the answers to which are not obvious. One of them, of course, is Iran. There are two problems with Iran. One is Iran in the region. Iran has borders on the two countries in which we have troops right now, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And they're there, and they're going to be there forever. So wouldn't it make sense for us to talk to Iran, even if we disagree about how they and we see Afghanistan and Iraq? We did cooperate for a time in the early days of the Afghan war, before we decided Iran was part of the axis of evil. But we haven't since. So there's Iran. It's a Shia country, Shia Islam, in a Sunni neighborhood. It's a Persian culture in an Arab neighborhood. So they have security problems. So that's the first one. Can we figure out some kind of a system that would let Iran feel more secure? Secondly is Iran and nuclear weapons. And I think the problem there is less that Iran has 3 or 4 nuclear weapons than what it will do to the region. Because if Iran is allowed to continue to enrich uranium, which is the key ingredient for making a nuclear weapon, it's easy to make an explosive device if you have the enriched uranium. If they're allowed to do that, I think we can be sure that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, in the region will go the same route, just in self-defense. And that may spread to Japan, South Korea, or until we have 30 or 40 countries a couple of months away from a nuclear weapon. That's not a better world. So that is a huge problem. The question is, what do we do about it? Sanctions haven't worked, probably won't work. The number of cases where sanctions have actually changed the fundamental behavior of countries, you can count on the fingers of one hand. It's not likely to work here. But use of force is extremely unattractive. We could destroy a good part of their nuclear establishment, probably not all of it, because we probably don't know where it all is. But that's just a delay. They can rebuild it and rebuild it deeply underground. And in the process of destroying it, we will give an indication to much of the Muslim world that we're just not against terrorist Muslims, that we're just against Muslims. I mean, it could really damage the ability of the United States to operate in the whole region. So the use of force is not attractive either. Is there a possible middle way? Well, I think that it is conceivable that if we, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese all have a solid front to Iran, don't go this step. We will provide you nuclear fuel for any reactors you want. You don't need to enrich uranium yourself. We will guarantee a supply. It might work. But to do that, we need to have at least a solid front. None of those powers want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but especially the Chinese and the Russians have a lot of other things going. The Russians, I think, are privately pleased to have us all tangled up with Iran. It keeps our mind off them. And they might not even mind a little war because it would do wonders for oil prices. The Chinese have a different motive. They get 10 to 15% of their oil from Iran, an increasingly valuable resource for them, and Iran's a good commercial customer. But if there's a conflict in the region, that's going to shut off Chinese oil supply, and what it doesn't shut off, the prices will go through the roof. So it seems to me that if we're practice some exquisite diplomacy, there's at least a possibility to make progress with Iran. But it is probably the most intractable issue we face. I can't remember when I was supposed to stop. Well, let me say just a couple more words. There are a lot of other issues, and we can deal with them in the question period. Let me say what I think in terms of Obama and his last thing, to do something in the world. I think he could do something which, of all of the options there are around the world to show some decisiveness, I think a move in the Palestinian peace process would have more widespread effect than anything else he could do. It would not just deal with that particular issue, but there is in the whole region a fundamental sense of injustice on the part of the Muslim world and the situation in the region, for which we get most of the blame. It feeds the attractiveness of Hezbollah and Hamas, who prey on the injustice, if you will, of the Palestinian situation. So I think if he were prepared to do that, and it would take a different approach. We have, up till now, provided the meeting room for the Palestinians and the Israelis to sit down and hope they can come to an agreement with each other. I think that's not likely to happen. But I think what we could do now is to build on what President Clinton left behind, which was very close to an agreement. And at the end of his administration, the Taba Accords, which the two sides had drawn up, represent a blueprint for a solution. And if the United States were to adopt those principles as the negotiating framework, 67 borders with mutually agreed rectification, no unlimited right of return of Palestinians to Israel, Jerusalem as a capital to both countries, I think that it would have an excellent chance of being a real game changer in the region. The president hasn't done that. He's tried to do something about settlements on the West Bank and failed, and now we're trying proximity talks, which is a significant step backwards from decisive action. But I think, on the whole, he's been in office a little more than a year. It is as tough a world environment in terms of being able to see the way through these various problems as any president in the last 100 years has had. And while the record is mixed, I think it's too early to come to a conclusion, and we all need to wish him well. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Please raise your hand, and I will start right back here. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you, General. I'd like for you to comment, you talked about some other regions, but what about the drone attacks that are currently taking place in Pakistan? Can you comment on your on that, please?
What kind of comment? Are they effective or are the... Well, one of the whole problems with terrorism is that we don't know how to characterize it. You know, we have two legal systems. We have a criminal justice system, which takes care of outlaws of one kind or another. We have the laws of war, which deal with uniform conflicts among powers. We don't have a system to deal with terrorism. What are they? Are they criminals? Are they soldiers? No, we call them illegal enemy combatants. Well, what's that? And how do you know one when you see them? If you see a person out in the hill in an enemy uniform, the laws of war says it's all right to shoot him. But if you see some guy down here going around in a burqa or something, well, a man wouldn't be in a burqa, but is it lawful? Is it not lawful? Are you both judge and executioner? Those are some of the problems that we're getting into along with the problem of the predators not being precise enough to eliminate the possibility of taking out civilians. If you find some people shooting from a house, for example, the predator can take out the room they're shooting in, but it'll probably destroy the rest of the house, and there may be women and children in it. That's the kind of problem we face. And that's why the rules for using predators have been tightened significantly. And we're also developing new kinds of munitions to put on them that are much less than a 500-pound bomb. Now, I don't know if that answers your question. It's got to be a pretty terrifying way of war for the recipients, because you know, you get hit and you don't even know where it's coming from. So it can be extremely effective, but there are all the questions about it that we have not come to grips with our legal system.
Got a question back here, Todd Moore, behind you, Bill.
Thanks for coming out. I'm a recent graduate of Clinton School. Really appreciate you being here. I have a question about a really difficult piece that I think you went through, and I want to see how difficult it was for you. You wrote an article and came out against the Iraq War, I think in 2004, and you have a deep history with George H.W. Bush. You have a deep history with Henry Kissinger, and I'm just curious how difficult it was for you to come out against the Iraq War at that time, really with all the things that were going on. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yes. Well, it was very difficult for me. It came out in 2002, where it seemed to me that we were moving rapidly toward hostilities with Iraq, and I didn't think we had examined the whole situation very thoroughly. And I've found in years of government that there frequently is a rush to decision, and the questions, what if? What if you fail? What if you succeed? What have you done? And so on. Frequently don't get asked. And what I really wanted to say is step back and think. There's no evidence that Saddam really is developing nuclear weapons. at least at a rate we need to worry about. He has really been quite well contained by the sanctions which were put on him. And in 1991, at the end of the first Gulf War, the first President Bush made a carefully considered decision not to go on to Baghdad, not to occupy Iraq. And I think for some of the reasons which we've seen in the years since 2003. So, yeah, it was very difficult to do, but I thought unless I did it publicly, no one would pay any attention to it. I did it publicly, and they still didn't pay any attention to it.
Questions? We've got one right here.
Much has been written about the Muslim immigration into Europe and to this country and the refusal to assimilate and the changing face of Europe. Do you consider that a national security threat?
Yes, I think it is. And it's much tougher in Europe than it is in the United States. It's very interesting. I was talking with a member of the government of the Netherlands, and he said, you know, for centuries, we have been known as a haven for those who are persecuted. You know, the pilgrims started out there and so on. We're tolerant. And he said, we're tolerant, but we don't know how to assimilate. Because Europe is much more tribal than we are. You know, Belgium now, for the third time, the government has fallen over the difference between the Walloons who speak German and the, I can't remember the other, what they call them, but the French and the Dutch. They're much more homogeneous and much less tolerant of outsiders. The United States has a very different history. You know, we started out, we've had our problem with Germans and Irish and this and that and the other, but it's not the same because we are a polyglot group of people. And it's going to be very hard to make that assimilation. And is it a national security? Yeah, it is, because what it does, we need a lot more study on what makes a terrorist. You know, what makes a young person, for example, strap explosives around their waist and blow themselves up? That's pretty unusual behavior. And that's the way we're going to figure out terrorism. Well, the more people are deprived of what they think are their just rights and so on, the more likely they are to turn to extreme measures. So it is a serious problem, and I hope, the growth of understanding is what it's going to take. I hope it happens.
All right, let's see. Let's go right over here. Mr. Catherine.
In the years that you were National Security Advisor, with hindsight, what advice are you most pleased with the outcome, and are there some advice that you wish this was not good, I wish I could have taken it back?
Yeah, but I don't know why I should tell you. Now, I think actually one of the things I'm actually most pleased about was our decision at the end of the first Gulf War not to go on to Baghdad. Because it was a hard decision to make, and we were accused. I know, I heard every time I went public, why didn't you finish the job? Well, we finished the job in 2003, and look what it cost us. And so I think that was in many respects, it was a counterintuitive decision. But I tell you, one of the reasons we did that is while we were thinking about what to do about Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, President Bush asked me to look at the examples during after World War II, where we had used force and what we had learned, good and bad. So I looked at Korea. And I thought one of the things we learned from Korea is don't change your objectives just because things are going very well. When MacArthur made that Incheon landing, went around behind North Korea, and it was so successful, we said, well, why don't we finish the job? So we marched onto the Yalu River, brought the Chinese in, fought for 2 more years, and ended up right back on the 38th parallel where we could have been before. So that was one of the motivating things that we did. There are so many that I wish I hadn't done. I'm just going to leave that one.
All right, question over here. Here, Chief.
General, given the tension in the United Nations Charter that you talked about not interfering with the internal affairs of other countries, and given that most civilized nations would be opposed to genocide, and given the inability of the United Nations to effectively deal with genocide over the last 50 years, what tools and strategies should the United States of America utilize to try to prevent the next genocide?
Well, I think the notion of the responsibility to protect is a good one. One of the chief problems has been China, because they interpret that as a way for us to interfere in Tibet, Taiwan, so on. I think we have to work with them on that, and they're getting a little better. They're much more cooperative, for example, in North Korea than they were when our goal was regime change in North Korea. And on Darfur, they're admitting that Sudan they have some responsibilities with respect to Sudan. They haven't gone very far, but at the beginning they said, we buy oil from Sudan. What they do with the money or what they do with that's got nothing to do with us. This is just pure commercial business. And the Chinese have that sort of attitude. They're very loath to engage in these bigger enterprises. And that's part of the problem in Iran. I don't think they want to see the spread of nuclear weapons, but let us deal with it. I think it's part of an education process with the Chinese, and I think we're making gradual progress with it.